What's up, guys? This is Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, episode 25 now of the podcast. I'm your host, Steven MacDonald, and for this episode, we're bringing it back to Skype to talk some Premier Lacrosse League and the 22-man rosters. I'm joined with my guy, Phil Rothermich, once again. Jordan Johnson couldn't be here with us this time, but we'll try to catch him on a later episode if we can. But Phil, let's jump right into it and kind of break down some of these rosters that were announced yesterday, and give me your initial thoughts on some of those.
Yeah, first, thanks so much for having me back on, man. I love it. Excited to be here. Few things that I noticed. I was talking about a little bit on a little clip I did yesterday, but of course, Twitter only lets you go to 1:20. So I was excited that you had me on so I could expand a little bit on that.
Absolutely.
The very first thing that stuck out to me was three teams, Atlas, Chaos, and the Whipsnakes, all took one face-off specials.
Yep.
Which is pretty, it kind of caught me off guard a little bit, because if there's any sort of an injury, even something minute, and they have to step out of the game for just a quarter or two, well, I'm sure every team has a backup plan, but, then you're on to your backup guy, no longer a specialist. Now, for Atlas, of course, they have Trevor Baptiste, who's the best face-off guy in the world right now. So, you can make a little bit of an argument for them. But the other teams, while they have good face-off men, it still is a little bit of a gamble to me. You know. So that was the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed was a little bit of the shuffle of each team and the importance. Most teams took 4 to 5 attackmen, which to me made sense. You need at least one guy to be rotating in there. 5 attackmen, I think, is a good move, because if you can have some fresh legs. So if you have Ryder Garnsey, Kavanaugh, Rambo getting just absolutely, going to the woodshed on Tucker Durkin, and they're just chopping wood on their arms, you're going to have someone sub in, especially since you're having so many games in such a short period of time. You got to keep guys fresh. You got to keep them healthy. Every team took 2 goalies. No surprise there. It's hard to have a backup plan for one goalie. And then teams loaded up on middies. Again, makes sense. These guys are going to be running up and down the field like crazy. You got to have subs. And then the last thing is, most teams took about 3 to 4 defensemen, and usually about 2 LSMs. Made sense to me. Archers took 3 of each. At first, I saw they only took 3 defensemen. Caught me off guard. But then after looking at the LSMs, I realized they got some guys they can bump down there and play close D if need be.
Right.
Chrome took 5 defensemen and only 1 LSM. However, like I mentioned, they have Reese Eddy marked as defense. He can bump up and play LSM if need be. So, quick rundown of things that I happened to notice right off the bat.
Yeah, and I mean, that was perfect, because I put together my list of things last night as I was looking over some of the rosters, and you pretty much hit on every single one of the things that I noticed as well. So it's good that we're kind of on the same page here. I think that'll work out pretty well as we move through this episode a little bit. And I think it's also important to note, as you started out talking about some of the face-off guys that these teams are bringing in, just the fact that some of them are only bringing the one. I think it is important to note, as we kind of step back here for a second, kind of understanding how these rosters were put together in the first place, and kind of understanding that restricted players list and how it's being designated. And really, as I read it yesterday through Twitter, is that the restricted players are basically only designated for if a player on that active 22-man roster tests positive for COVID-19 during that pre-travel testing period, which will take place in a few weeks. And that once you actually get to Utah, that 22-man team that you bring is locked in. Like, that's the 22 that you get. So barring any injuries or anything like that, if bodies start to drop, so to speak, you're kind of stuck. There's nothing you can do about it at that point. So I thought that was very interesting as well. And when you get into position speak, like with the face-offs, like you mentioned, only bringing one guy does kind of limit your options there. And I think it was Joe Keegan yesterday that mentioned how important bringing that extra face-off guy was, because if you looked at the end of last season when the Atlas were playing without Trevor Baptiste in that playoff game, I believe he said they won something like 9 of 37 faceoffs, and it completely just tilted the field one direction in favor of the Archers, excuse me, and that's why the score ended up being what it was. So I definitely think that those are kind of some of the things that you have to notice when looking at some of these rosters. And then the other thing is that with that waiver period from just a few weeks ago, any player that was picked up during that time is automatically brought on that 22-man roster, assuming that they pass all the COVID testing and things like that in a few weeks. But some of the teams like the Chrome completely overhauled their rosters through the waiver period with some of the moves that they made. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was that through the trade getting Matt Gaudette, signing Jesse King and Brendan Kavanaugh through the waiver wire, actually bumped out a guy like Ty Thompson from that starting attack unit. And I wonder if it was because they knew he wasn't going to be able to go, or if it was just a move that Tim Soudan decided to make on his own or something like that. I'm not sure. We haven't heard anything about that in specific, but yeah, I mean, just going down everything that you talked about, you pretty much hit on everything that I had on my list as well, especially kind of breaking down the difference between offense and defense, especially through that midfield. The teams, like you mentioned, loading up on midfielders, especially with the Atlas we talked about on that Skype series a few weeks ago with you, me, and Jordan, how the Atlas are probably one of the deeper teams at midfield, and they actually were able to find a way to get all of those guys in on that 22-man roster, which I think in itself is kind of impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, midfielders, of course, they're going to be paramount. I mean, if the ball gets down to one end, middies are there. Ball gets down to the other, middies are there. Now, then you have some defensive middies, you have some offensive middies. But let's be honest, any midfielder can be stuck on either side of the field. And that's a lot of running, whether you're just going in for offense or just going in for defense as well. So you definitely want some guys in there for sure. And to go back to your face-off point, I mean, that's exactly right. What you were saying there with Trevor Baptiste. That's a huge, huge drop-off. And what happens if he even has a minor injury and has to go out for just 2 quarters?
Yeah.
Let alone if he sprains an ankle and has to go out for, a week. And I think that's one thing that people need to remember is how big injuries are going to be. You sprain an ankle during the regular season, I don't know how long a normal ankle sprain is, maybe 4 weeks, whatever it is, 3 weeks. The point is it's just 3 games or it's 4 games or it's 2 games, and then you continue on.
Yeah.
But you sprain an ankle now, or you sprain a wrist or get a cracked rib, whatever it is, well, that really impacts you.
Yeah.
That is really going to be tough. So injuries are going to be a big factor. And like you said about the restricted players, people really need to be paying attention to who those players are and get familiar with them.
Yeah.
Because if any other pro league has shown us, there are going to be players that test positive. Now, I hope I'm wrong. The guy down the street hopes I'm wrong. My cousin hopes I'm wrong. We all hope I'm wrong in hoping that everyone is fine, test negative.
Yeah.
But statistically, someone's going to test positive, if not a few. So get familiar with those restricted players. Learn who they are, because some of them are going to bump in. Yeah, so there's just a couple thoughts on what you were touching on there before.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting with the restricted lists, kind of looking at, like you said, the names that are on that list. I wonder if the order that they were presented in is kind of the order that they would be brought in, depending on how many guys from that current 22-man roster. Like you said, if they test positive, obviously they can't go. So I know on one of the lists, I believe for the Chaos, Austin Henningsen, I believe, was their number 1 guy listed on their restricted list. So I wonder if that means that he would be that first guy kind of called in to assume that spot that is then vacated by whoever tests positive. As you mentioned, hopefully nobody does, but the odds are kind of against believing that. So, but yes, I mean, it definitely is interesting to watch that and, like you said, see who's on those lists, because there are actually quite a few highly talented players that probably should have made a 22-man roster at least somewhere in the league that didn't. So I think it'll definitely be interesting to see how that shakes out here over the next few weeks, as we're 22 days away from the start of the championship series. So definitely a lot to look forward to with that over the next few weeks.